Virtual entities are a read-only entity that you can create in CRM that you're pulling from an external source, but it never gets stored in CRM.
So meaning that if you wanted to go like do an advanced find, could you use it? Or if you tried to navigate, could you go to like, what do you mean it? Or
yeah, so when you do an advanced find or you create, not create, but when you're opening an existing record or looking at a view, each time you open up the page that would have those records on it, that's when it does the call to whatever API that you've specified in there.
What would virtual entities be used for?
So virtual entities would be used if you, let's say you have another system that's holding all your orders or holding a bunch of customers, but you don't actually you don't need to do any data manipulation with it in CRM. You just need to see it and just be able to kind of look at it within CRM. You're not running, it's read-only data, so you're not doing any plugins against it since it has to go and actually call those external APIs when you do it. You can create a relation, but the relationship has to be between another virtual entity. So you
can't relate to it out of the box or a custom entity.
Yeah, it doesn't relate that way. So let me just dive into actually setting one up. So in settings, under administration, there's virtual entity data sources. And this one, the component layer solution and solution history are ones that were added from some other third-party thing that's on JMA demo. But usually you're creating a new data source.
Logan, that used to be restricted, I think, to just OData. Is that still the case?
Yeah, there's OData, which is the main one. And then 2 years ago, Microsoft said this is, okay, let me back up a little bit. So we have OData v4 as a data provider. So your provider is what you're using to actually get the data source. So this is OData, so it'd be a RESTful service. And then they have an app source. So when they first originally released this and were announcing it, they said we have OData and then we have an Azure Cosmos DB data provider that you can connect to. And Azure Cosmos was like kind of the big release around then. So they were trying to get that to go through. But after 2 years, this is still in preview.
Wait, the Cosmos DB is still in preview?
The Cosmos DB data provider. So being able to connect to
got it.
Azure Cosmos DB through this data provider is still in preview. And they were also hoping that a bunch of developers would create data providers and so that you could connect to other external data sources that have APIs, and nobody's built any yet, really. So it kind of didn't really work out like they wanted it to. So pretty much OData v4 is your only bet if you're going to do a virtual entity, unless you want to go and develop a data provider yourself, which we can do, but that takes a lot of time, and you're going to be connecting to a OData inside of your plugin, and then so OData is pretty much your best option there. And so I'll show you the one that I created. One big kind of issue was I was trying to see if I could get this to connect with Business Central, but it does not connect with Business Central because virtual entities require that that whatever entity they're calling you can get to it. Its primary key is a GUID. So the Business Central, their API does not have like any of their entities with a GUID on it. So you're not able to connect to it through virtual entities. So I'll show you one place that does have it is OData.org. This is just people who kind of built the OData service, and this is just a sample service that you can go to. So the URL would pretty much be your endpoint. And that's going to look like this. So it'll have all of your different pieces that you can, different entities or whatever they're called in that external data source, tables. And if you do metadata after that, then you can get the specification of all of your, what each of those fields are stored as. So if we're looking at, let's say, a product, and we want to see if this service can handle a product, I look and I see the key is an ID, and the ID has a type of int32. So we can't use it as a virtual entity. But down lower, there is advertisements, which has a primary of ID and the type is GUID. So through virtual entities, we can get these. So go back to OData. It asks for a parameter name, and that's if you need to authenticate. So if you need to do like a basic OAuth header, and this is, but you just need to give it whatever the parameter type is, and then if it's like this one would be authentication, and then you'd have your value over here, whatever the value is. So different services, I mean, different APIs can have different request parameters, so it's all based on whatever API you're trying to hit. So this one doesn't have any, it's just a free open source service.
Real quick question. Do you have any examples of places we can actually use this? I mean, can we connect to an on-premise SQL database, or what kind of things can we actually use it for? Because it sounds like this OData piece is pretty restricted.
We'd have to look at it per API basis. So an Azure SQL database, I know that they have RESTful endpoints that you can hit. You would just have to have your table in SQL would need to have primary key that's a GUID. So
something like GP on premise would not work.
If they don't store a GUID as the primary key, then no. Getting to on premise, I'm trying to think. GP has a web service that you can call to, right, Eric?
Yeah, it's not OData though. I think it's just REST, not OData.
Yeah. So the part that is kind of a bummer is going through this. It just kind of hit limitation after limitation, and I think that's a lot of the reason why virtual entities has been around for a year and a half and it hasn't taken off at all. So, so here's the data sources created. So now we go into our solution and actually create the virtual entity. So I created a virtual entity called advertisement. The display name and plural name, that can be whatever you want, but the external name needs to be the name of the table, and the external collection name needs to be the name of the collection when you're actually calling it in the API. So this one, you'll see that the entity is advertisement, so just on its own. And then the entity set is advertisements with yes on the end. So that's, you know how to get multiples of those. To create that, you'll need to check virtual entity, and then it will enable this data source field, and you select the data source you created. So I created the odata.org. And then you don't really need to do anything else. Anything else is just basically if you need any, just how you would set up any other entity. But you're not going to be able to do pretty much most of these, any of the activities, connections, access teams, since it's just read-only data. The other thing is when you create these, it'll, by default, it will create an ID field and a name field. And then you will want to go into those fields and add an external name. And so the external name would be in your service, that primary key, so it's ID. And then it will have it as system required. And then your name field over here is name, and its type is a string. So it's a single line of text. External name is name. And another thing that I found out while doing this is if it has a type of nullable false, that means it's a required field, and it will need to be business required in CRM, or else it'll just throw an error and not come over. So name will always be set as business required, but when you add like another field, like I added air date, and air date has a nullable of false, which means it can't be empty. So it's a required field. So I just had to set business required. And then looking at it, it's a date time. And so then I selected date time as the type. And then once you publish that, and you can come into, so yeah, put under marketing, and then your entity shows up just kind of like any other entity would. And so this takes about twice as long to load as typical entities in CRM, since it's having to call out. So then you have your records from that other external data source. So it's got early morning and old school lemonade. And so if we were to look at that in the service, you'll see that there's old school lemonade and early morning start. And so it's pulling in all the records that are coming from that API. And then you can click into it and open it kind of like you would any other entity. And then you have all your fields that you've exposed, and then it will always be locked as read only.
Have they, I don't know the best way to ask this, and maybe we covered it while I stepped out for a second, but have they given any recommendations or even said, hey, these are within even the Microsoft stack, some of the best scenarios or use cases of data sources? Because one, we haven't built out the common data service for it yet, or two, because we know that, you know, we have that data feed. Did you run across any of that while you were going through your research?
Yeah, it's mainly, it needs to be OData version 4. That's about it. So like
So
Business Central is OData v4, but they just don't have it as the ID. So
so really the three requirements are OData, it's version 4, and you can get a GUID or an ID.
Yeah, and
To pull the record.
there is a decent amount, and I didn't have time to get this into a pretty looking form, but there.
You did half your job, Mike.
But
Woohoo!
there is, so data's read only. Only organization-owned entities are supported, so you can't do any permissions on it. Field level security is not supported. And there's the must have a GUID. So you can use like simple types and lookups, but any of the entity relationships, they have to be modeled in Dynamics 365, but it's between like two virtual entities.
So one of the things I'd probably ask then as we look at this is, I mean, we know Business Central because it's not going to give it an GUID or GUID.
Yep.
Say it the other way.
Or a GUID ID.
Yeah, GUID ID. But do we know, does like Planner have an OData before, or Teams, or like, so if we went down the list of all the Microsoft sort of, stack applications, it'd probably be a good reference for us so that we knew, yeah, we can pull that data in and show it here. Like I'm thinking a big one would be somebody's Active Directory profile, like that you could show in terms of, hey, there's the user and then here's their Active Directory profile.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah,
I'm sure there's tons of those types of scenarios.
Yeah, that'd be a good list to get together.
All right. What other questions does the group have? Or other thoughts or use cases where they can see this being valuable? Crickets.
Well, I had WGBH today asking, they wanted to use virtual entities because they didn't like the idea of having to keep an external record of ad spots, think television ads or radio ads, and then have to pull that data, the same exact data, into Dynamics for us to, process some financial numbers off of them. And so we talked about some pros and cons, and I think luckily, ultimately, they decided they didn't, they were okay not having a virtual entity as an external reference. But I was strongly opposed to using it because they wanted to keep data that we would use for calculating values, and what I see, a plug-in oriented, large volume, nightly recalculation, financial calculation routine. They wanted to have some of the data required for that stored in a virtual entity. And even though they say Cosmos is like a zero latency database, you still have the time required to make a network request and get the data back. And so I was pleased that we ended up not heading that direction, because I think it would have slowed us down very, very, very much.
Yeah. And this is that virtual entity I created was, like I've created this one and one other one, and they, like loading wise, half of it depends on the API that you're hitting, but CRM also does a bunch of its calls, and so it definitely takes longer than just an entity that's stored in CRM.
The use case that I looked at that ultimately didn't work was Roscoe Brown wanted to display account credit information inside a CRM that says they're on credit hold, or this is what their current outstanding balance is, and they wanted the people in CRM to be able to see that but not edit it. But since that was GP on premise, we couldn't do it.
Yeah.
So once this data is in CRM, what really can you do with it?
You don't, it's not in CRM. So it's just,
Well,
it's still,
it's accessible. So once you have it accessible,
you can see it, but that's it. So this is just so that somebody can go in and they don't have to go into another system. So let's say they wanted to see all of the customers that came from, I can't think of another data source, but like one of their websites. They just wanted to see customers there. They didn't want the customers to actually be in CRM, but they just needed to.
Can you
see
create views or whatever off of this entity then?
Yeah, so you can have views, anything that's like just read only. So you can have your, like, do an advanced find off of it. But you're mainly only just looking at whatever gets pulled over.
And you wouldn't be able to do any kind of calculated fields off of that, right?
Nope.
There's no way to have another entity reference that and do calculations off of that.
Yeah, it won't let you do it. Yep. It is mainly just so you can see. That is it.
Depending on the data source, would this be a good replacement for insight functionality? Like referencing websites? You
If
somehow tie your contacts into the view and manipulate it that way and find out information from another website that they might have on their customer.
if that website has a service on it where you can pull that stuff, then yes. And as long as it fits those other specifications where it's OData v4, which is in the newest, and then has to have a ID, a GUID for the primary key.
I'm just wondering about LionTree. I'm sure they're going to start saying, hey, we want to be able to pull data from this website or that website.
Yeah.
So-
Well, yeah, and it all depends on where it's stored from those websites.
Okay.
That's accessible through a service. But knowing LionTree, they're gonna want to do stuff with the data, and it's not gonna.
True. And we need to emphasize the read-only aspect.
Yeah.
That being said, for all I know, they'll want to just use Alteryx or Tableau to get the data into some kind of dashboard or something.
Mm-hmm.
That's what somebody's there for.
Any other questions? Nope. Okay. Well, Eric went on a call, and I don't know if he has anything else that he wants to discuss. We might be able to just. Was he the one that recorded the meeting?
I think so.
That's a problem.
I was just told to scribe.
Okay. I think that's it for this, since Eric is not here, so I don't know what else
Has a
he.
topic to demo or just?
Yeah, it's just me.
The little red dot at the top left says Eric is recording it.
Okay, so he's recording externally. So you want to go answer a call.
Interesting to see how much of this actually got recorded.
Yeah. Well, if he's still on it, then it should still be recording from him. But okay. Well, we're gonna jump off, and if Eric says, "Oh, I had something else," we'll let you know.
Thanks, Logan.
Yeah.
Thanks, Logan.
Nobody spoke up.
See ya.